3 years. That's how long it had been since I'd last set foot on my mountain cabin property. 3 years since I'd heard the crunch of gravel beneath my tires on that winding forest road, or smelled the crisp scent of pine carried down from the ridge. Life had taken me elsewhere. Work, family, and a sudden illness had pulled me away. But through all that time, the cabin had remained mine. It was my retreat, my slice of peace carved into the woods, standing quietly by the lake like a memory waiting for me to come back. When I finally turned off the paved road and onto the familiar dirt path, the first thing I noticed was how much wilder the place looked. Weeds crept along the edges of the driveway, and the once trimmed bushes around the entrance had grown into tangled shapes. My old mailbox was rusted and leaned to one side, the paint on the post peeling. Still, it was home, or so I thought. The sound of my truck engine echoed off the trees as I pulled into the clearing where the cabin stood. The sunlight broke through the branches, splashing golden light across the wooden porch. I felt a wave of nostalgia hit me, strong enough to make me pause before I even turned off the engine. But that feeling lasted only a second, because that's when I saw it. A sign. A bright red, freshly posted "No Trespassing" sign nailed right onto the trunk of one of my pine trees. Another one was on the gate post, and another nailed crookedly to the front of my shed. The signs weren't old or weathered. They were new, bold, and deliberate. Confusion hit first, then disbelief. Who would post those here? There was no mistake about whose land this was. My name was still on the deed. My taxes had been paid every single year, automatically drafted from my account. No one had the right to post those signs. As I got out of the truck, I felt a strange silence settle over the property. Even the usual hum of insects seemed distant. I walked slowly toward the porch, scanning the yard. Someone had been here recently. The grass near the steps was matted down in tracks, like someone had walked there often. The small storage shed I'd built beside the cabin looked like it had been opened and shut multiple times. My old lawn chair, the one that used to sit near the dock, was gone. I stepped up onto the porch and ran my hand across the wooden railing. It was rougher than I remembered, weathered from years of rain and sun. The key was still under the same loose board where I'd always kept it, but when I unlocked the door, something felt off even before I entered. Inside, the air was different. The faint smell of cleaning products lingered, not the earthy, slightly musty scent of a cabin left alone too long, but the artificial freshness of someone who had been living there, cleaning, organizing. My furniture was there, but the arrangement wasn't mine. The blanket I'd left folded over the couch was missing. There were new curtains on the windows, floral ones that I had never seen before. I froze, taking it all in. Someone had moved things around. Someone had made themselves comfortable here. Out back, the dock looked the same, though the old canoe was gone. A small sign had been staked near the waterline. Private property, residents only. That was the moment when the truth began to take shape in my mind, unwelcome and absurd. Someone from the HOA, the local homeowners association that had jurisdiction over parts of the mountain community, must have assumed I was gone for good. Maybe they thought the cabin was abandoned. Maybe they thought they could expand their control or repurpose the land. I had always kept my distance from the HOA when I lived here before. They were a notoriously overzealous bunch, the kind that treated every fallen branch or overgrown shrub like a personal offense. I had joined the association years ago only because it was required for property owners in the area, but I had never attended their meetings or paid much attention to their memos. Apparently, in my absence, that had been a mistake. As the sun dipped lower, I checked the locks, took photos of the "No Trespassing" signs, and started to piece together the situation. Whoever had posted those signs had done so boldly and publicly, confident that I wouldn't be coming back to challenge them. I walked along the property line, tracing the old wooden stakes I'd placed when I first bought the land. Every few yards, another bright red sign appeared, shouting a warning to stay away from my own home. Then I noticed something worse. Down near the main road, where my driveway met the community path, a metal fence had been installed. A gate with a lock. A small plaque read, "HOA access restricted, authorized residents only." My access road, my only direct way in, was now under HOA control. A sick feeling crept through me. Someone had decided that I didn't belong here anymore. As dusk fell, I sat on the porch steps, the chirping of crickets beginning to fill the cool evening air. I thought about all the years I had spent here before, the mornings fishing at the lake, the weekends spent fixing up the cabin, the quiet evenings by the fireplace. It was all mine once, and now someone had tried to erase that with a few signs and a lock, but I wasn't about to let it go. That night, as I set up my sleeping bag inside, because the bed linens were gone and the power was flickering from what looked like tampering, I decided I would uncover exactly what happened. Who had claimed my land, who had the audacity to put up those signs, and why the HOA thought they could dictate my right to return. Outside, a car slowed near the gate, headlights sweeping over the trees. I saw a figure briefly silhouetted against the fence, watching the cabin. Then the car drove off. They knew I was back, and something told me that by morning, the HOA would make their move. By sunrise, the stillness of the woods had changed. The soft hum of morning birds was joined by something mechanical, the low, distant growl of an engine winding up the gravel path. I had been awake for hours, sitting on the porch with a cup of instant coffee, staring at the line of no trespassing signs that littered my own property. I didn't have to guess who was coming. I already knew. Sure enough, a silver SUV emerged from between the trees, moving with the slow confidence of someone who believed they owned the road. It stopped just beyond the locked gate. A woman stepped out. Perfectly pressed blazer, oversized sunglasses, clipboard in hand, the unmistakable uniform of an HOA president on a mission. Her name was Karen Whitmore. Everyone in the mountain community knew her. She had been president of the Homeowners Association for nearly a decade, ruling the neighborhood like a self-appointed sheriff. I'd heard stories even before I left, how she fined a family for hanging their laundry outside, how she forced another homeowner to repaint their cabin because the color didn't fit the natural tone of the forest. She thrived on control, and from the look on her face as she spotted me, she wasn't happy to see that control slipping. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She simply stood by the gate, speaking into her phone while scribbling something on her clipboard. I couldn't hear her from the porch, but I didn't need to. I could imagine every word. Trespassing, illegal occupation, violation. I walked down the driveway, calm and deliberate, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots echoing in the morning quiet. As I reached the gate, she lowered her sunglasses and gave me that kind of look only certain people could muster. The one that said, "I'm in charge here, whether you like it or not." She spoke for several minutes, waving her papers toward the cabin and occasionally gesturing toward the road, as though explaining her version of events to an invisible audience. I didn't respond. I just watched her. Finally, she pointed directly at one of the no trespassing signs, and then at me before turning on her heel and walking back to her car. The SUV's tires kicked up a small cloud of dust as she drove away. But she didn't drive far. She parked at the end of the road, where she could still see my property through the trees. Watching. Waiting. That's when the reality of the situation began to sink in deeper. Karen didn't just want to intimidate me, she wanted to make an example of me. The cabin, to her, was no longer my property. It was a prize. Something the HOA had claimed in my absence. As the morning went on, I started documenting everything. Photos of every sign, every fence post, every change to the property line. My power meter showed signs of tampering. The seal had been broken. My water line had been shut off and capped with a lock. It wasn't just about control anymore. It was a calculated effort to make me leave. Around noon, another car appeared. A small dark sedan with the HOA logo painted on the side. Two men stepped out wearing polo shirts and name tags. Compliance inspectors. They didn't cross the fence line, but they took photos from the roadside, talking quietly and occasionally glancing in my direction. Their presence was almost theatrical, like a warning performance staged for the benefit of the neighborhood. By mid-afternoon, I could see Karen back at her SUV, now joined by two more vehicles. A small crowd of curious neighbors gathered near the fence, whispering among themselves. Most of them looked uneasy. A few pointed toward the cabin. I could imagine the story spreading already. Someone came back after years away and is squatting on HOA property. But the truth was simple and provable. The title deed was in my name. I'd paid every property tax on time. My ownership wasn't a rumor. It was a fact. The HOA had no legal standing to claim otherwise. Still, I knew people like Karen rarely cared about legality when they had authority to hide behind. That evening, I sat inside and flipped through the stack of old HOA letters I had saved years ago. Among them was a faded community notice about revitalization efforts for the lakeside area. The association had long wanted to turn the northern section of the lake into a members-only recreation zone. My cabin sat right on that section. It all made sense now. They hadn't just assumed I was gone. They had planned to take this land, fold it into their jurisdiction, and block me out completely. My absence had made it easy, but my return, that was an inconvenience they couldn't ignore. When dusk began to settle again, I saw headlights moving slowly along the ridge road. Not one car this time, but several. The convoy stopped near the gate. A few people stepped out carrying flashlights and cameras. Karen was among them, front and center. They started taking pictures again, of the property, of my truck, even of the front porch light glowing faintly through the trees. Then I saw her nail another sign onto the post by the gate. HOA notice of encroachment, unauthorized occupancy. That was the final straw. They weren't just bluffing anymore. They were building a paper trail, a set of official records they could later use to claim I was trespassing. The signs, the photos, the witnesses, it was all a setup. That night, the woods felt different. The crickets were drowned out by the hum of distant engines and the occasional flicker of flashlights through the trees. I locked the doors and sat by the window, the glow of my lantern flickering across the room. They thought they could pressure me into leaving, that I'd back down quietly rather than deal with the hassle. But they didn't know me. I'd built this cabin with my own hands. I'd cleared the land myself. Every nail, every plank, every stone in the fire pit was mine, and I wasn't about to let anyone rewrite that history. So I began to plan. The next morning, I would drive into town, pull every record I could from the county office, and collect every document proving my ownership. I'd make copies notarized and official. If Karen wanted to play the game her way, then I'd bring the rules with me. Still, as I drifted into uneasy sleep, I couldn't shake one thought. Karen wasn't finished. She'd be back, and next time she wouldn't come alone. The next morning began with a heavy fog settling across the lake, muffling the world into silence. The trees stood like ghostly sentinels, their reflections trembling in the still water. For a brief moment, it almost felt peaceful again, until the faint thud of a car door broke the calm. I peered through the mist and saw a white sedan parked near the gate. A man in a suit was standing beside it, clipboard in hand, taking photographs of my mailbox and the path leading to the cabin. Another car followed, this one bearing the same HOA insignia as the ones from the day before. They weren't neighbors. They were officials, Karen's reinforcements. When I stepped outside, the suited man lifted his camera again, snapping a photo of me standing on my own porch. He didn't wave or call out. He simply wrote something down, turned back toward the gate, and drove away with the others. By the time I reached the main road, a new sign had been posted on the HOA's community board near the entrance. It read, Notice of Property. Dispute Cabin Number 47, Lakeside Zone B, is under review for ownership validation. Residents are advised that unauthorized occupancy will be treated as trespassing under HOA guidelines. Below it was a printed signature, Karen Whitmore, President, Mountain Lake Homeowners Association. I stared at the notice for a long time. There it was, her false claim in writing. She was publicly declaring my home as disputed territory. To the neighbors, it would look like I was the intruder. To the HOA, it was just procedure. But I knew what it really was. A carefully orchestrated lie. That afternoon, I drove into town and parked in front of the county recorder's office, a squat brick building that smelled of old paper and dust. Inside, I requested every record connected to my property: purchase documents, tax statements, title deeds, plat maps, and any notices filed during my absence. The clerk was an older man who recognized my name immediately. He remembered when I'd bought the cabin years ago and even commented that my property had one of the oldest private docks on the lake. As he gathered the files, he frowned. "That's strange," he muttered. "Someone's been requesting copies of these same records recently." My stomach tightened. When he handed me the copies, I scanned through them quickly. Everything was as it should be. My name on the deed, taxes paid in full, no liens or sales filed. But then I saw an unfamiliar document attached to the back. A petition for abandonment declaration dated 6 months ago, filed by the Mountain Lake HOA. It stated that the property known as Cabin 47 appeared abandoned and neglected for over 2 years, showing no signs of maintenance or occupancy, and therefore was subject to reassignment for community preservation. And the signature at the bottom, bold, proud, and unmistakable, belonged to Karen Whitmore. She had filed to have my land declared abandoned. That explained everything: the signs, the fence, the control over the road. The HOA had submitted paperwork to claim ownership through neglect, a loophole that might have succeeded if I hadn't come back when I did. By returning, I had ruined her plan. But Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat. I knew she would double down now, using every rule, every technicality, and every ounce of power her position gave her to force me out. I spent the rest of the day making certified copies of every document proving my ownership. I even requested notarized letters from the clerk verifying the property's tax status. When I left the office, I felt prepared, but also angry. Angry that someone had dared to twist the law to steal what wasn't theirs. Angry that the community I once called peaceful had turned into a petty dictatorship under one woman's control. When I got back to the cabin, there was a bright yellow envelope taped to my front door. Notice of violation. Unauthorized structure modifications. It accused me of performing unapproved renovations, citing the porch railing and dock as non-compliant with community standards. The fine listed was outrageous. The date on the notice was that same morning, while I was in town. They hadn't wasted a minute. Over the next few days, the pressure escalated. HOA patrols drove by more frequently. Each time, they slowed down just long enough to take a picture. One morning, I found that someone had placed orange survey markers along the edge of my property, tiny flags that crept several feet inward from where my original stakes were set. They were trying to redraw the boundaries inch by inch. The final insult came 3 days later. I returned from the hardware store to find a "for sale" sign leaning against the fence near the gate. Beneath it was a small printed flyer from the HOA office advertising future development opportunities in the Lakeside District. It was as if they were already writing me out of existence, but I wasn't powerless, not anymore. I had everything I needed to prove the truth. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table and spread out the papers. The fog had lifted, and through the window I could see the stars shimmering faintly above the lake. The cabin was quiet except for the creak of wood settling under the cool night air. I drafted a formal report, organized, time-stamped, and supported by evidence. I included photos of every no trespassing sign, every violation notice, and every piece of tampered property. I attached the deed and tax records, all officially verified. By the time I finished, it was a thick folder, a weapon of facts against the falsehoods the HOA had built. But I knew this wasn't over. Not even close. Karen would fight back the only way she knew how, through bureaucracy and intimidation. The next step, I was certain, would be an official visit. And sure enough, the very next morning, the sound of tires on gravel broke the quiet once again. I stepped outside just as a county vehicle rolled to a stop in front of the gate. 2 people climbed out, clipboards in hand. One was a property assessor from the county office. The other wore the navy blue vest of an HOA representative. Karen was with them. She looked composed, smug even, as she stood behind the fence while the assessor greeted me politely and explained that they were there to verify an ownership discrepancy regarding cabin number 47. Karen watched from behind her sunglasses, her expression perfectly neutral, but her satisfaction radiating like heat. It was clear she had brought the county in to challenge my claim. But what she didn't know was that I had already been there first. As the assessor reviewed my folder, flipping through page after page of stamped and notarized proof, I saw the faintest shift in his expression. Surprise, then discomfort. He looked at Karen, then back at the documents. Her confidence faltered for the first time. When he asked her to produce her association's ownership documentation, she hesitated. The papers she handed over were incomplete, filled with unsigned forms and a petition that hadn't been approved by the county court. It was a small victory, but an important one. Karen left without saying a word that day. The county officials assured me they would review the documents and close the dispute if everything checked out. But I could see it in her eyes before she turned away. This wasn't over. She had lost a round, not the war. As dusk fell once again, I sat by the window, watching the lake ripple in the fading light. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. The truth was on my side, and for the moment, it had held. But deep down, I knew Karen wasn't done. She had too much pride, too much control to walk away quietly. And whatever came next, it wouldn't just be legal. It would be personal. The morning after the county visit, the air around the cabin felt heavier, tense, like the forest itself was holding its breath. For the first time since returning, I sensed something shift. The quiet hostility of the HOA had turned into open retaliation. Karen had lost her first attempt to claim my land, and people like her didn't take public embarrassment lightly. I woke to the sound of tires crunching over gravel again. Another car, this time a white pickup truck with bold blue lettering along the side. County Code Enforcement. 2 uniformed officers stepped out, followed by none other than Karen Whitmore herself. She stood back as they approached the porch, arms folded, her face a perfect mask of smug professionalism. They were carrying documents. When I opened the door, one of the officers handed me a thick envelope. Inside was a notice printed on official letterhead: Order to vacate, unpermitted occupancy, and unsafe structure conditions. According to the document, my cabin had been reported as structurally unsafe and non-compliant with community safety standards. It claimed there were multiple violations: improper electrical wiring, fire hazards, and potential contamination from a deteriorating septic system. None of it was true. Every repair I'd done over the years had been up to code, and the septic tank had been professionally serviced right before I left. I looked up at the officers, realizing immediately what was happening. This wasn't about safety. It was a coordinated attack. Karen had used her influence with the county inspection board to file false complaints. She was trying to evict me through legal loopholes since the ownership route had failed. While they walked the perimeter of the property, taking notes and pretending to conduct an inspection, Karen stood by the gate pretending to talk on her phone. But I could see her watching me, measuring my reaction, waiting for me to lose control or make a mistake she could use later. Instead, I stayed calm. I let them finish. When they left, I told them I would respond formally to every claim in writing. As their vehicles disappeared down the road, I walked back to the porch, the envelope still in my hand. My anger was rising, not the kind that burned hot and quick, but the deep, cold kind that settled into your bones. I had lived here peacefully for years, paid every fee, followed every rule. Yet now, because one woman decided I didn't belong, I was being treated like a criminal. That evening, I called the county office. The man who had helped me before recognized my name and sounded concerned when I mentioned the eviction notice. After checking the system, he confirmed what I suspected. No inspection request had been officially filed by the county. The order had been pushed through under a community emergency code, something only a local association could trigger temporarily. In other words, The HOA had forged urgency to make it look legitimate. The next morning, I drove back into town with my growing file of evidence. I met with the county's property oversight department and explained everything: the forged abandonment petition, the fake safety violations, the trespassing signs, even the fence blocking my access road. The officials listened carefully, took copies of the paperwork, and promised to investigate. But I knew investigations took time. And time was what Karen was trying to rob me of. Every day she could keep the pressure up. She thought I might give in and leave. By the time I returned home that afternoon, the attack had escalated again. Bright orange tags were plastered across my porch and front door. Each one had the words, "Do not enter," stamped in bold black letters. The power had been cut off completely, and the main breaker box had a county seal sticker placed across it, one I hadn't seen before. I tried calling the power company, but they told me the disconnect order came from the HOA's community safety officer. It was clear now. They wanted to make the cabin unlivable. That night, I lit a lantern and sat in the dark, staring at the cold reflection of the lake outside. The silence was thick, broken only by the faint creak of the old dock and the occasional hoot of an owl somewhere deep in the woods. My phone buzzed with messages, mostly neighbors. Some were supportive, quietly warning me that Karen had been going door to door, claiming my cabin was condemned. Others didn't know what to believe. One message stood out, a photo of a post on the HOA's social media page. It showed a picture of my cabin with the caption, "Safety alert. Vacant structure under review for hazardous conditions. Please report any suspicious activity near this area." She had publicly painted me as a squatter. The next morning, a local deputy arrived, responding to a trespassing complaint. He was polite, but clearly confused when I showed him my deed and all the legal paperwork. After a quick radio check with the county, he apologized and left. But as he drove away, I could see Karen standing near the gate again, watching. Her arms crossed like a queen surveying her territory. Her plan was unraveling, but she was relentless. Days passed in a tense rhythm. Each morning brought a new form of harassment, a violation notice, another sign, a complaint to the sheriff's office, or a car idling near my property just long enough to make me uneasy. I could tell she wanted me to slip up, to get angry, to confront her in a way she could twist into justification for legal action. But instead of reacting, I documented everything. Every car, every tag, every notice, time-stamped and photographed. I built my case piece by piece, quiet and steady. Then, one evening, I noticed something strange. The chain across the gate was gone. The padlock was lying broken on the ground. At first, I thought maybe the county had come to inspect again. But when I walked closer, I saw fresh tire tracks cutting across the grass near the shed. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, several of my tools were missing. My old generator, gone. The lock had been pried open, and muddy footprints marked the floor. It wasn't hard to guess who had sent someone out here. I called the sheriff's office again, filed a report, and handed over my security camera footage. It wasn't much, just faint images of figures moving near the shed after dark. But it was enough to prove someone had entered illegally. The next day, the deputy came back with news. The footprints matched boots used by one of the HOA's maintenance contractors. He said they were investigating the matter, though he hinted that the association was trying to frame it as routine maintenance. That was the moment I realized Karen had overplayed her hand. She'd gone from bending the rules to outright breaking the law. When the county finally concluded its investigation 2 days later, I received an official letter. All property rights remain valid. No safety violations confirmed. HOA's jurisdiction over cabin number 47 null and void pending further review. It was over, at least on paper. But I knew someone like Karen wouldn't accept a loss quietly. She'd built her identity around control, and losing it would cut deep. I could already picture her next move, rallying the board, stirring up outrage, turning the community against me one rumor at a time. As night fell, the cabin finally felt calm again. The power had been restored, the porch lights glowing softly against the trees. For the first time since returning, the property felt alive, mine again. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this peace was temporary. People like Karen didn't stop. They regrouped. They waited for the next opening. I stood by the dock, the lake stretching out like glass under the moonlight, and I made myself a quiet promise. If she came for me again, I wouldn't just defend myself, I'd expose everything she had done. The HOA had crossed a line they couldn't uncross, and soon the whole town would know it. The morning after the county's ruling felt different, lighter somehow. The fog that had clung to the lake for days had lifted, and sunlight poured over the trees like a quiet victory. The cabin stood strong, its windows gleaming in the early light, no longer hidden behind warning signs or orange tags. For the first time in weeks, the silence outside didn't feel oppressive. It felt earned, but I knew it wasn't truly over. Not yet. Karen Whitmore had built her entire sense of authority around control. Control over the community, over the land, over the people who lived under her rules. And when someone like that loses control, they don't surrender gracefully. They retaliate. I could almost feel it in the air, a storm gathering before the sky even darkened. Sure enough, it came 2 days later. That morning, a thick envelope arrived in the mail, bearing the HOA's letterhead in bold black font. Inside was a formal declaration: cease and desist, defamation and harassment. The letter accused me of spreading lies about the HOA, damaging their reputation, and harassing community officers. It demanded I vacate the property until an independent investigation could be completed. It was Karen's last desperate play, a bluff. Dressed in legal language, I sat on the porch and read it twice, then placed it neatly into my growing folder of evidence. This wasn't an attack anymore. It was documentation of her downfall. Every false claim, every unauthorized action, every piece of fabricated paperwork had become proof, not of my guilt, but of her abuse of power. That afternoon, I drove into town for what would be the final step. The county office had already concluded that my property was lawfully mine, but what they didn't yet have was the full picture. The harassment, the false reports, the break-in, the manipulation of local authority. So I handed everything over: the video footage, the forged inspection notice, the survey markers that had been illegally moved, even the social media post branding me a trespasser. The clerk I met with listened quietly as I explained each event in order, from the day I returned to the cabin to the day the power was cut off. By the end, she wasn't just listening, she was taking notes. Real ones, detailed ones. Within a week, the investigation shifted from a property dispute to something much bigger. The county's legal department opened a formal inquiry into the Mountain Lake Homeowners Association for misuse of authority, unlawful property tampering, and falsification of records. Karen's name appeared in nearly every section of the report. I didn't need to guess how she reacted when she found out. The next few days were strangely quiet. No patrol cars, no HOA inspectors, no cars parked along the road watching my cabin. Even the no trespassing signs that had once stood like sentinels along the property line were gone, removed overnight, as if they'd never been there. It was the calm before collapse, and deep down, I knew the storm had finally turned on her. A week later, the county held a public meeting in the town hall to discuss the HOA's conduct. The place was packed. Neighbors, local reporters, homeowners from nearby communities, all curious to see what would unfold. I sat near the back, unnoticed at first, while Karen stood near the front row, immaculate as always, her blazer crisp, her expression carefully neutral. But as the hearing began, the mask started to crack. The county investigator laid everything out in front of the board: the false abandonment petition, the tampered survey boundaries, the illegal eviction notice, the unauthorized power shutoff. Every document was projected onto the screen for the crowd to see, each one stamped with her signature. Murmurs spread across the room, growing louder with every new revelation. When they reached the part about the break-in at my shed and the involvement of an HOA contractor, Karen's composure faltered. Her hand trembled slightly as she clutched her folder. Someone from the back whispered her name, and the sound rippled through the crowd like a wave. By the time the investigator finished, the entire room knew the truth. The HOA had overstepped its authority in every possible way. The board voted unanimously to dissolve the current HOA leadership, pending legal review. Karen was suspended immediately, stripped of her title and privileges. The county ordered the association to pay fines for unlawful enforcement and property interference. For the first time in years, the mountain community had a reason to breathe. When the meeting ended, Karen left without a word. She walked out the front doors of the town hall, eyes fixed forward, the weight of her defeat visible in every step. The same neighbors who once feared her control now turned away in silence. In the weeks that followed, change rippled through the neighborhood. The authorized access gate that had blocked my driveway was taken down. The HOA office was closed temporarily for restructuring, and the new acting president, a quiet, reasonable man named Daniel, reached out personally to apologize for everything that had happened. He told me that the association would be reviewing all past complaints, refunding false fines, and rebuilding the community's trust from scratch. It was a start. Back at the cabin, life finally returned to what it had been before: quiet, simple, and mine. The scent of pine drifted through the air again as the season began to turn. I spent my mornings repairing the dock, restoring the furniture, and sitting by the lake as the mist rolled across the water. One afternoon, as I raked leaves near the porch, a small group of neighbors stopped by, people who had once avoided even looking my way. They offered kind words, apologies, and even a few home-baked pies as a peace offering. It wasn't necessary, but it reminded me that not everyone had sided with Karen's corruption. Some had simply been afraid to speak up. That night, I lit a fire in the old stone pit and sat watching the flames dance against the dark. The cabin glowed softly behind me, and the lake reflected the stars like a mirror. For the first time in a long while, I felt at peace, not just because I'd reclaimed what was mine, but because justice had finally caught up to those who tried to take it away. Weeks later, a letter arrived in the mail from the county clerk's office. It was a final notice, a statement of resolution declaring that all ownership disputes regarding my property were permanently closed. It also confirmed that the HOA had been fined and placed under county supervision for the next 3 years. At the bottom of the letter was a handwritten note from the clerk: "Glad you stood your ground. Sometimes the only way to beat the noise is to outlast it." I folded the letter and tucked it into the folder with the rest of the documents. My proof. My story, my victory. The forest outside was quiet again, just as it had been when I first built the cabin years ago. The wind rustled gently through the trees, and the sound of the lake lapping against the dock filled the air. Karen's no trespassing signs were gone, but in their place I nailed up a new one. It was simple, made of hand-carved wood, hanging from the front post where the old one had been. It didn't warn anyone away. It just said, "Welcome home." And for the first time in 3 years, it truly was.